Saint Teresa saw what happens when partners no longer ask how the other is feeling. Have you ever been in the same room as someone you love and felt completely alone? Not the kind of alone that comes from an empty house, but the kind that comes from sitting across the dinner table from someone who used to know your every thought and realizing that neither of you has asked the other a real question in weeks. No deep question, no curious question, just logistics, just schedules, just the surface of a life shared but no longer truly touched. That silence is not nothing. That silence is something. And Saint Teresa of Avila, the 16th century Carmelite mystic, doctor of the church, and one of the most psychologically sharp human beings who ever lived, saw exactly what that silence does to the soul of a relationship and to the souls of the people inside it. Teresa was not a marriage counselor. She was a nun who spent decades mapping the interior life of the human person with a precision that modern psychology is still catching up to. Her great work, The Interior Castle, written in 1577 in a single burst of inspired writing over a period of just weeks, describes the soul as a diamond castle with 7 layers of rooms, each one drawing the person deeper into love, clarity, and union with God. But what most people miss is that everything Teresa writes about the soul in that castle, she also observed in how human beings relate to one another. Because for Teresa, how you treat another person's interior world is not separate from your spiritual condition. It is your spiritual condition. So when you stop asking how the other person is really feeling, something in that castle goes dark. And Teresa saw it happen. She documented it. She lived through versions of it herself. And what she described is not gentle. It is not a soft warning. It is a portrait of what emotional abandonment does to a human being from the inside out, described by someone who had the rare combination of mystical vision and brutal honesty. If you value documented history and spiritual insight like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support this work. And drop a comment telling us what city you're listening from right now. This script is researched and factual, drawing primarily from Teresa's own autobiography, known in its original Spanish as the Libro de la Vida, written between 1562 and 1565, and from the critical scholarly edition published by Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez through the Institute of Carmelite Studies in 1976, a translation considered the most academically rigorous available in English, and the one used by serious theologians, historians, and researchers when they need to go past the popular summaries and into the actual words Teresa left behind. Now back to the story. Teresa of Avila was born on March 28, 1515, in Avila, Spain. She entered the Carmelite monastery of the Incarnation in 1536 at 21 years old, and almost immediately she began noticing something that would take her decades to fully understand. The interior life of a person could flourish or wither entirely based on whether that person felt truly seen by another. In her autobiography, she writes about the years she spent in the parlor of the convent, receiving visitors, chatting, engaging in the social rounds expected of convent life at the time. She calls those years a kind of spiritual paralysis, not because conversation is evil, but because the conversations were shallow, polite, empty. No one was asking real questions. No one was listening to real answers. And Teresa, who had one of the most alive and searching minds in the history of Christian mysticism, slowly felt herself going numb inside. She writes that during those years, she would begin prayer and find nothing there. Not resistance, not darkness, just a strange hollow where something used to be. She was 40 years old before she finally understood what had happened. And the moment she understood it, she wept in front of a painting of a wounded Christ and made a decision that changed the rest of her life. She would never again sacrifice depth for comfort in a relationship, not in friendship, not in community, not with God. She had seen what that sacrifice costs, and she was not willing to pay it again. Now here's the part that matters for you, for anyone in a relationship, for anyone who has watched a marriage or a partnership slowly drain of warmth without being able to name exactly why. Teresa made a direct connection between emotional presence in human relationships and the health of the inner life. She was not vague about this, she was specific. In The Interior Castle, in the description of the first dwelling place, she writes about souls that are so distracted by external things that they have no capacity to enter themselves. They are so busy managing the surface of life that they never go inward. And she says the tragedy is not that they choose distraction. The tragedy is that they do not even know they are choosing it. It has become automatic. It has become the air they breathe. And the person beside them, the partner, the companion, the one they promised to know, is breathing that same thin air and wondering the same wordless thing. Does anyone in this house actually see me? Teresa saw the pattern everywhere around her, in the convent, in the families who came to speak with her, in the letters she received. She was one of the most prolific correspondents of her century. 458 of her letters survive. She sent them to dukes, to bishops, to her brother Lorenzo in the Americas, to young nuns struggling with prayer, to friends facing failing marriages. And across those letters, across those 458 documents, One theme surfaces again and again in her diagnostic voice. The relationship that stops asking is the relationship that starts dying. She does not use those exact words. She would not. She speaks in the language of prayer and soul. But the structure is identical. When you stop seeking the interior of the other person, you stop inhabiting your own interior. The two are linked. The curiosity you extend outward is the same faculty you use to go inward. Shut it down in one direction, and you lose it in both. This is not metaphor. This is Teresa's actual theology of relationship. And modern psychology has arrived at almost exactly the same place through a completely different route. Let us go to the research for a moment, because this is not just a spiritual intuition. This is documented human behavior, studied with precision across decades. In 1973, John Gottman began his research at the University of Washington into what makes marriages succeed or fail. By 1992, he had developed what he later called the Four Horsemen model, identifying contempt, criticism, defensiveness, and stonewalling as the primary predictors of divorce. But the deeper finding, the one that gets less attention, was what he called turning toward versus turning away. When one partner made what Gottman called a bid for connection, a small attempt to get the other person's attention, interest, or curiosity, what the other partner did in response predicted the relationship's fate more accurately than any other single variable. Couples who turned toward each other's bids at a rate of 86% or higher were still together and reported satisfaction 6 years later. Couples who turned toward each other at only 33% were separated or deeply unhappy by that same measure. The bid for connection is the question, how are you feeling? What are you thinking about? What happened to you today that you haven't told me yet? And the failure to ask it, sustained over months and years, is not a small thing. It is a structural collapse, slow and invisible, happening in the walls while the surface stays quiet. Gottman's lab published these results across multiple studies through the 1990s, ultimately culminating in the book The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work in 1999, co-written with Nan Silver. The finding was replicated, peer-reviewed, confirmed across different demographic groups, different income levels, different cultural backgrounds. The specific variable of emotional curiosity, the practice of turning toward another person's inner life with genuine interest, emerged as among the most powerful predictors of relationship longevity available in the data. Not passion, not compatibility of interests, not shared finances, curiosity. The willingness to keep asking the question even after you think you already know the answer. Now consider what that means in years. A couple married in their late 20s who stops practicing genuine curiosity toward each other by their mid-30s has 30, 40, 50 years of proximity ahead of them. Decades in the same house, the same bed, the same table, while something essential slowly disappears from the interior of both people. Not because anyone intended harm, not because anyone stopped loving the other person in some abstract sense, but because the specific practice of asking, of wanting to know, of being surprised by the person beside them was quietly abandoned somewhere around the time life got complicated and the questions started feeling like a luxury they did not have time for. Teresa would say they were wrong about the luxury. She would say it is not a luxury at all. It is the house. It is the actual structure of the relationship. And when you take it out, the whole thing still stands for a while, held up by habit and shared history and practical necessity. But it is standing on nothing. And both people inside it can feel the draft. Teresa would have recognized Gottman's findings immediately, not because she knew the science, but because she'd already mapped the spiritual equivalent from the inside. She called the interior life of a person a castle with many rooms. The deepest rooms, the ones where the real self lives, can only be entered through invitation, through being asked in, and when no one asks, those rooms close, not with anger, with grief, and eventually not even with grief, just with a kind of forgetting that what was once there ever existed at all. She watched this happen to women she knew in the 16th century whose husbands treated them as household managers rather than as persons with interior lives. She watched it happen to novices in her convents who were so busy performing religious duties that they forgot to be present to anyone, including themselves. She watched it happen to men of learning and position who had stopped being curious about anything outside their own established views. And in every case, she described the same result, a kind of spiritual hardening. A person who had once been alive in a particular way that was now sealed over, still functional, still socially presentable, but unreachable in the place that matters. Here is what makes Teresa's observation terrifying. She says this process is almost entirely invisible while it is happening. From the outside, a relationship can look perfectly fine for years while this is occurring. The couple goes to dinner, they manage the house, they raise children, they attend events, they smile in photographs. But inside the private world of that partnership, one or both of them has stopped asking the question that keeps a relationship alive. What is actually happening inside you right now? And the person who is not being asked, Teresa says, begins to disappear. Not dramatically, not all at once, but room by room, the inner castle goes dark, First, the person stops sharing spontaneously because they have learned it will not be received with real curiosity. Then they stop noticing that they have stopped sharing. Then they begin to feel that what happens inside them does not really matter to the person beside them. And once that feeling solidifies, it does something that Teresa describes with remarkable precision. It turns inward into the person and becomes a kind of coldness, not anger, colder than anger, a withdrawal of the self from the relationship, so gradual and so quiet that sometimes even the person withdrawing does not notice it is happening. And here is what makes that process so difficult to reverse. By the time one or both partners name it, by the time someone finally says something feels wrong, years of that withdrawal have already happened. The person who is not being asked has already reorganized their interior life around being alone inside the relationship. They have found other places, other people, other private corners of their life to hold the things that used to be shared. Not because they chose loneliness deliberately, but because the alternative, continuing to offer something that is consistently not received with curiosity, eventually stops feeling possible. The offering mechanism itself goes quiet. Teresa writes in her autobiography in Chapter 8 about her own experience of this during the years she spent divided between genuine prayer and social performance in the convent parlor. She describes feeling as though she had become two people, one who performed connection and one who observed the performance from somewhere far inside, growing quieter and quieter because the outer performance was using up all the energy and leaving nothing for the real interior life. She writes that she lived this way for nearly 20 years before she could name it, 20 years, in a religious community surrounded by people, talking every day and profoundly, architecturally alone in the place that mattered most. She eventually traced the root of it back to one thing. She had stopped being asked real questions by the people around her, and because no one was asking, she had stopped asking herself. The inner inquiry, the checking in with her own deepest experience, had gone dormant for lack of practice in the outer relational world. It was not separate from what was happening in her relationships. It was the same thing, showing up in two places simultaneously. Teresa experienced this herself. In her autobiography, she describes a period in her middle years when she felt completely unseen by the people around her, including by God, whom she experienced at the time as absent. She writes about feeling as though she were living behind glass, present but not actually there, visible but not seen. And she says the only thing that began to break that feeling open was a single encounter with another person, a confessor, who asked her a question and then actually waited for the answer, actually listened, actually wanted to know. She writes that the experience of being truly asked was so unusual at that point in her life that it made her weep, not from sadness, from recognition. Something in her that had been waiting quietly and without drama to be seen finally was. And she says the effect was immediate and physical. Something loosened, something began to move again in her that had been still. She spent the rest of her life trying to create conditions where that kind of encounter was possible for people. In the communities she founded, she insisted on what she called friendship in truth. This is a specific phrase she uses in her writings. Friendship in truth means you do not perform wellness for each other, you do not manage how you appear, you actually tell the other person what is happening inside you, and you actually ask what is happening inside them, and you actually stay with the answer, even when it is complicated or uncomfortable or inconvenient. She founded 17 Carmelite convents across Spain between 1562 and 1582, the last year of her life. In every one, she fought against the tendency she called the spirit of worldly politeness, which she described as the habit of saying the socially acceptable thing rather than the true thing. She had no patience for it. She wrote to her communities repeatedly that this kind of politeness is not kindness, it is a form of abandonment. You are abandoning the other person to their interior aloneness because it is more comfortable for you to stay on the surface than to go down with them into the real. Think about that in the context of a marriage or a long-term partnership. Every time you answer fine when you're not fine, and your partner accepts fine without pushing, both of you have made a small transaction in the currency of that abandonment. It costs almost nothing in the moment. It costs almost everything over a decade. Teresa describes a particular kind of spiritual suffering she encountered in people who had been living inside that kind of relationship for a long time. She calls it a dryness of the soul that comes not from sin, but from neglect. She is careful to distinguish between the two. The person is not doing something wrong. They are simply not doing the thing that keeps the interior life alive. They are not asking. They are not being asked. And the soul, like a garden that receives no water, does not die all at once. It dries from the edges inward, slowly, and for a long time it still looks green at the center, until one day it does not. She saw this in families who came to her for counsel. A husband and wife who had been married for 20 years, who had built a life together that looked from the outside like success, who came to her because something was wrong that neither of them could name. And Teresa, in her letters and her accounts and the testimonies of people who spent time with her, is recorded again and again as doing the same thing in those situations. She would ask one of them, "When did you last ask your partner a question you did not already know the answer to?" The answer, almost always, was silence. Not because the person was cruel, not because they did not love their partner, but because at some point, without deciding to, they had stopped being curious about the person beside them. They had formed a complete picture of who that person was, and they had stopped updating it. And the actual living person, who had been changing and growing and carrying new things inside them every single year, had been left alone inside that change, because no one was asking them about it. Teresa called this one of the great cruelties of intimate life, and she meant it. She was not soft about it. She said that to stop being curious about a person you love is to tell them, without words, that you believe you already know everything worth knowing about them. And no human being, she said, can survive that message in a relationship without beginning to close. The closing is the tragedy, not the argument, not the betrayal, the quiet closing. Subscribe if this kind of deep dive into documented history and human experience is what you come here for. And tell us in the comments what city you're in right now. This research draws from Teresa's own writings and from the authoritative Kavanaugh and Rodriguez critical translation published by the Institute of Carmelite Studies, a scholarly source used by academic theologians, not popular summaries, because the actual words Teresa left are far more precise and far more devastating than any paraphrase. Now back. In The Interior Castle, Teresa describes what happens in the later stages of this kind of emotional neglect, with a specificity that is almost clinical. She writes about souls that have entered what she calls the rooms of the second dwelling place, people who are aware enough to know something is wrong but not yet equipped to name it or change it. They can feel the distance, they can feel the dryness, but they keep reaching for explanations that are not quite right. They blame circumstances, they blame stress, they blame external pressures. Because the true explanation, that the relationship has stopped feeding the interior life because it has stopped practicing genuine curiosity, is almost too simple to believe. Surely it cannot be that the problem is just that we stopped asking each other real questions. But Teresa insists that it is exactly that. She is almost impatient about it in her writing. She says the soul does not need elaborate explanations. It needs presence. And presence begins with a question, a real one where you do not already have the answer ready, one where you are actually willing to be surprised by what the other person says. In her autobiography, she describes her friendship with a woman named Doña Guiomar de Ulloa, a wealthy widow in Avila who became one of Teresa's closest companions and one of the financial supporters of her reform. Doña Guiomar is recorded in historical documents as having provided Teresa with her home as a place of refuge during some of the most politically dangerous moments of Teresa's reform work in the early 1560s. She appears in Teresa's correspondence across multiple letters, always with warmth, always with specificity. Teresa does not write about her the way she writes about obligations or colleagues. She writes about her the way a person writes about someone who changed them. Teresa writes about what made that friendship different from others she had known. It was not the shared beliefs. It was not the shared work. It was that Doña Guiomar asked her questions that no one else asked. Questions about what Teresa actually thought, what Teresa actually feared, what Teresa actually hoped for. And Teresa, who by that point in her life had been performing spiritual composure for so many years that she had almost forgotten what her own interior voice sounded like, writes that those conversations were like being given back something she had not known she had lost. That is the phrase. Being given back something she had not known she had lost. Because that is what happens in the best moments of a long relationship. And it is also what stops happening when the questions stop. You carry your interior life with you everywhere. It does not disappear, but when no one asks about it, it goes underground. It becomes private in a way it was never meant to be. And you begin to feel in the quiet hours a loneliness that is different from any other kind. Not the loneliness of being without people, the loneliness of being with someone who does not ask. There is a specific detail in Teresa's account of those conversations with Doña Guiomar that is easy to miss but carries enormous weight. She says that what made Doña Guiomar's questions different was not just that she asked them, but that she was willing to sit in the silence after asking. She did not immediately offer an answer. She did not immediately move to comfort or solution. She asked and she waited. She held the space open. And Teresa says that space, that willingness to wait inside the question with another person, was more healing than any answer could have been. Because what the soul most needs, when it has been alone for a long time, is not someone who has the answer. It is someone who believes the question is worth waiting for. Teresa writes about the aftermath of those conversations with Doña Guiomar with a kind of wonder. She says she would leave those meetings and go to prayer and find the prayer completely different, more alive, more fluid, as if something that had been locked had been opened by the simple experience of being genuinely asked about. This is the connection she is drawing. The curiosity you practice in relationship is the same muscle you use in prayer, in self-examination, in any deep encounter with the real. When you stop using it in one place, you lose it everywhere. And when someone exercises it toward you, when someone actually wants to know what is happening inside you, it wakes that faculty back up. It reminds you that your interior life exists, that it matters, that it is worth the attention of another person. Now here's the thing that most people miss when they hear this. They think the solution is a weekly check-in, a scheduled conversation, a prompt from a relationship app. And Teresa would say, that is better than nothing, but that is not what she means. What she means is a quality of attention, a genuine orientation toward the other person's interior world that is not turned on and off by a schedule. It is a posture. It is the way you sit when you eat with someone. It is the question you ask when your partner walks in looking like something happened. It is the pause you make before answering fine to actually consider whether fine is true. It is the willingness to be surprised by the person you have known for 10 years, to hold the possibility that there is something happening inside them right now that you do not yet know about. And she gets very specific about what blocks this willingness. She identifies 3 things, and they are as recognizable in the 21st century as they were in the 16th. The first is what she calls the busyness of the exterior life. Too much to do, too many obligations pressing from outside, until the quiet needed to be genuinely curious about another person simply does not exist. The second is fear. The fear that if you ask a real question, you will receive a real answer, and a real answer might require something from you. It might be complicated, it might be painful, it might change something you were comfortable leaving unchanged. So you do not ask. You choose the safe version of the conversation, the one that stays on the surface, where nothing requires too much of you. And the third thing she identifies, the one she says is most dangerous because it masquerades as virtue, is what she calls false peace, the unwillingness to disturb the apparent harmony of the relationship by introducing genuine depth. Everything seems fine. Why risk making it not fine by asking real questions? Teresa is fierce about false peace. She says it is not peace at all. It is the surface of a lake in winter, solid looking. But if you step onto it, you discover very quickly that the depth below never froze. And the person living under that false peace, the one who has stopped being asked and stopped being seen, knows the difference. They always know. They are just waiting with diminishing hope for the surface to crack. Teresa calls this the practice of recollection in relationship. Recollection in her framework means gathering yourself, pulling your attention inward toward the real, away from the noise and the surface. And she says, you can do this for another person. You can recollect your attention toward them. You can bring your full self into proximity with their full self. And when you do, something happens in the interior of both people that cannot happen any other way. She writes about this in the 3rd dwelling places of the interior castle. The 3rd dwelling places are where she describes people who are living good, ordered lives, doing the right things, but who have become, in her word, tepid. Not cold, not malicious, tepid. And she says tepidity in the spiritual life is one of the most dangerous conditions because it looks like health. It performs all the functions of health. But inside, the fire that was once there has been turned down so low that the person can no longer feel it. She describes a specific sign of this tepidity in relationships that is almost shocking in its accuracy across 5 centuries. She says you can identify a relationship that has gone tepid by watching how the 2 people handle interruption. When something unexpected happens, when one person suddenly has a strong reaction to something, when emotion breaks through the surface unexpectedly, does the other person stop and ask about it? Or do they smooth it over? Do they change the subject? Do they make a joke? Do they offer a solution before fully understanding the problem? Teresa says the smoothing over reflex is the sign, the instinct to restore surface calm rather than go down into what broke the surface. And it comes, she says, from a deep discomfort with the interior life of the other person, a discomfort that developed so gradually through so many small moments of choosing comfort over depth that it no longer registers as a choice. It feels like personality. It feels like just how things are between us. But Teresa insists it is a practiced avoidance, and it can be unpracticed. She is talking about the spiritual life, yes, but she is also always talking about the interior life of relationships, because for Teresa, those are not 2 different things. The way you show up in your most intimate relationship is the way you show up to God. They are the same capacity, the same faculty, the same openness or closedness. And the question that she keeps returning to in the interior castle, in the autobiography, in her letters, in the accounts of her conversations preserved by the women who lived with her and witnessed her daily, is this. Are you still curious about the person beside you? Not about their schedule, not about their health in a clinical sense, about who they are becoming, about what they are carrying, about what they wonder about in the middle of the night when the house is quiet and the day is finally over? If you are not asking, she says, you are not in relationship with that person. You are in proximity with them. And proximity, she knew, is one of the loneliest conditions a human being can endure. because it has the shape of connection without the substance. In 1582, October 4th, Teresa of Avila died in the town of Alba de Tormes in the arms of Ana de San Bartolome, the nun who had been her secretary, her nurse, and her most constant companion in the final years. Ana de San Bartolome was born in 1549 in Almendral, a small village in the province of Avila, and she entered Teresa's service in 1577, 5 years before Teresa's death. She was one of the few people who stayed with Teresa through everything: the exhausting travel, the political battles, the illnesses, the last months when Teresa could barely move without help. Ana later wrote her own autobiography, an extraordinary document now held in archival collections in Rome and Antwerp, in which she described in detail what Teresa was like in those last hours. Ana testified in the beatification proceedings that in the hours before her death, Teresa was extraordinarily present, alert, asking questions. Even then, even in the last hours, she wanted to know what was happening with the sisters. She wanted to know how people were feeling. She was still oriented outward, still practicing that quality of attention she had spent a lifetime teaching, right up until the moment she stopped. She was canonized in 1622 by Pope Gregory XV, together with Ignatius of Loyola, Francis Xavier, Isidore the Farmer, and Philip Neri. A remarkable group, canonized together all within the same ceremony. She was declared a Doctor of the Church in 1970 by Pope Paul VI, becoming one of only 4 women ever to hold that title in the entire 2,000-year history of the Catholic Church. The others are Catherine of Siena, declared a doctor in the same year as Teresa, Thérèse of Lisieux declared a doctor in 1997, and Hildegard of Bingen declared a doctor in 2012. 4 women. Out of 37 doctors of the Church total, Teresa was the first. But here is the late fact that reframes everything we have just heard. When scholars went back to the manuscripts of the interior castle in the 20th century, they discovered something about the composition that had been mostly overlooked. Teresa wrote that book in 1577 under direct orders from her confessor, Father Geronimo Gracian. She was ill. She was exhausted from the previous decade of reform, which had included founding 12 new Carmelite communities since 1562, traveling thousands of miles across Spain by mule cart and foot, negotiating with church authorities, fighting legal challenges, managing the personalities and spiritual struggles of hundreds of women under her care. She was 62 years old in a century when 62 was old. And she was managing the political fallout of her reform movement and fighting simultaneous battles with church authorities who wanted to dismantle everything she had built. And she wrote the interior castle in 2 extended sittings, the bulk of it produced in under 2 months, interrupted only by her administrative duties. What that means is that the interior castle, one of the most sophisticated psychological and spiritual documents in Western literature, was produced by a woman who was simultaneously overworked, physically unwell, politically embattled, and completely, genuinely curious about the interior lives of the people she was writing for. She was asking, even in writing the book, she was asking the question she spent her life asking. What is actually happening inside you? What rooms have gone dark? What is it costing you to live on the surface? And what would it take for you to go down into the real again? The answer she gave, again and again, across 58,000 words in that book and across 458 surviving letters and across 46 years of documented religious life, was always the same. Start with a question. Ask the person beside you what is actually happening inside them. Mean it. Wait for the answer. Stay with it when it is complicated. And then ask again tomorrow. Here's the detail that the scholars found when they examined the original manuscript, now held in the Royal Library of El Escorial outside Madrid. The manuscript shows evidence of hurried writing, crossed out words, corrections in the margins. The handwriting shifts in pressure and size across the pages in ways that suggest Teresa was writing at different hours, under different physical conditions, sometimes clearly in pain. But there is one characteristic that remains absolutely consistent across all 212 folios of the original document. The sentences that describe what happens to a soul that is genuinely seen by another human being are written in Teresa's clearest, most deliberate hand. As if, even when everything else was difficult, those were the sentences she knew exactly how to write, because she had lived them, because she understood, at a level below language, that this was the most important thing she was trying to say. The room that no one enters does not stay empty. It fills with what was never said.